Well, welcome to the History Film Forum, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Chris Wilson. I'm the Director of Experience Design here at the National Museum of American History. This is our second go-around with the running this film festival that is, we like to say, the premier film festival focused on history in the United States. And we just hope that it grows and grows. So we've been working with the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has partnered with the Smithsonian to bring to you stories and subjects on the screen and talk about film really as public history, as all the issues around the way many of us get our lessons and the way many filmmakers and historians interpret history for large audiences. And so again, we're very happy to be working with the National Endowment for the Humanities, and I'd like to introduce one of our colleagues across the mall, Jeff Hardwick, who is the Deputy Director for the Division of Public Programs at the National Endowment for the Humanities. Jeff.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to everyone. Good to see you on this beautiful day outside to come in and watch a film. I'm very proud to be here representing National Endowment for the Humanities, which I hope you all know is a little federal agency located across the mall. We fund, ideally, the best of humanities projects to bring to the public, including, of course, documentary films. We partnered with the Smithsonian 2 years ago, I guess now, to create this film forum because we believe in the power of film to convey important truths about American history and history in general. We will, over the next several days, we'll look at film as an art medium, but more importantly, we'll also look at it as a form of public history, one that shapes the way we think about our past, about our nation, and about our relationship with the past. Over the past 5 decades, NEH has supported over 800 films. I was trying to get the exact number. I think it's like 832 films that bring together top humanities scholars and some of the nation's best filmmakers. One of the best parts of our job when we are in the weeds of our job is reviewing scripts and reading people's scripts. Like this one you're about to see. Slavery by Another Name does what the very best documentary films should do. It opens up a new chapter of our history, one that we thought we knew, and provides a new light on that history. This one is especially important, I think, in terms of thinking about incarceration and what happens to people while they're incarcerated. This film is a collaboration by filmmaker Sam Pollard and journalist Doug Blackman. We're both here today, along with Twin Cities Public Television's Catherine Allen, who worked on this as well. It takes another look at the era immediately after the end of the Civil War. It reveals that in the decades after slavery, new forms of forced labor emerged that kept African Americans trapped in a system that endured until the 1940s. When this film was broadcast originally on PBS in 2012, more than 3 million people watched it in a single night. But they didn't just watch the film. People were moved by it. They were all over Twitter talking about their family histories, about their community histories. One viewer, Reverend Heber Brown, who saw the film with members of his congregation in Baltimore, wrote, "Slavery by Another Name gave birth to a passionate and positive energy that I pray is of the sustainable kind. This can't fizzle out. It's too important. I know you'll feel the same way after seeing this film, and join us after the film for a screening, for a discussion with Sam and Doug. And Doug, I think you wanted to say a couple words beforehand?
Hi, I'm Doug Blackman, the author of the book, Slavery by Another Name, on which the film was based, and then one of the producers in the film project. We've also got with us, in addition to Sam Pollard, the director, and another producer, Sheila Curran Bernard, who was the screenwriter on the project as well, so I didn't realize Sheila was going to be here. So, but yeah, this is I started working on the book that led to the film now 17 years ago. And it began with a story in the Wall Street Journal that appeared in 2001, but I've been working on for a year and a half, I guess, at that point, and then led to a book 7 years later, and then the film 4 years after that. And one of the things that you'll see in the film tonight, we don't make a point of it, but is that even the film itself became another iteration of the history and the story in a very humanities-driven kind of way. One of the most moving things for me, and humbling things really about this whole thing, in addition to it taking over my life the last 20 years, are all the different ways that the book and the film spurred other kinds of creative work by other people. And so there are formal and modern dance choreographies based on the life of Green Cottenham, one of the main characters in the book, who's also portrayed in the film. There are art installations that have traveled around the country that are based on or inspired by the book or the film. This whole range of remarkable creative work by all kinds of other people, and people taking the heart of the story and then digging out other facts of the story. And now there's all kinds of additional scholarship and journalism and history that's been written that, for some reason, the book and this film have helped to make it easier for other people to say some things that were hard to say before. And I think in film, that has lent itself to things like the documentary 13th that has been such a big hit this year, the Free State of Jones, if you saw that film a couple of years ago, even 12 Years a Slave. I mean, so much of the filmography of the last several years, and that element of it, I think, was really aided by that this work made it okay to say things as extreme and radical as this film says about our history, and that now actually don't seem so extreme and radical. But when the book first came out and when the film came out, it was very hard for people to accept that idea that the slavery really hadn't ended. But the one thing I'd definitely point out to you to watch for in the film is that there are a series of characters of living people interviewed in the film who essentially take it over, in my opinion. They're the stars of the film, and they took it over from us as we were making it. And those were all descendants of various people who, after the book came out, these people would come up to me at public events, or they reached out to me in other ways and said, well, I'm the grandson or the granddaughter or the whatever of that obscure character. And they were both descendants of people who had been victims. No surprise that they would pop up, but also descendants of people who had done really terrible things, people who had connections back to these horrifying events. And so over the initial reservations of my collaborators on this, because generally in a film, what does it matter what the grandson or the great-grandson of some historic figure has to say about that historic figure? They don't know anything more about them than any of us would. But it turned out that those characters, once we began to talk to them, they began to speak to each other over the course of the film. And I think that for me, they take the film away from the rest of us. One last thing, and then I'll let you actually watch it, and I hope you can stay around for the conversation Sam and I will have later. Speaking of the National Endowment for the Humanities and also PBS, where this first aired and continues to air over and over again, I probably don't need to say this in Washington, D.C., but those are both organizations which I think you've heard about being under great threat. And all of us who care about this kind of work and care about the next film that Sam and I will also be talking about at 6 o'clock, that'll hopefully be out next year, also a major funded by the NEH Film, likely to be on PBS as well. So don't take for granted that these institutions will still be around a year from now or 2 years from now. And if they're not around, then don't take for granted that films like this will still be around or still be able to be made. So whatever your part is to play, play it. But thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can we give our filmmakers one more hand for that very powerful film? My name is Xavier Carnegie. I'm the host of the My American Roots web series here at the National Museum of American History. I really want to thank you all so much for taking the time to come to see us and also for sharing your film with us. And I want to ask you guys a couple of questions. And at the end, we're going to open it up to a Q&A from the audience. If everybody takes a look to your right and left, at the very end of the rows in the middle, there are microphones set up for you all if you would like to ask our filmmakers a question. I want to start with you, Doug.
I want to say one thing
Yeah, go ahead.
before you. I want to You know, when you make films, it's a real collaborative process, and just watching the film today, which I haven't watched in a long while, the cinematography of Andrew Young is just phenomenal. He did a great job, and the music by Michael Bacon really moves this movie along. They did fabulous, fabulous work.
You're absolutely right. As a work of art, it's excellent. I wanted to start kind of at the beginning with the book and then kind of transitioning that into the film. So Doug, if you will, you already have the book. It has the same name. Why does this story need to be told on film, and what is it about film that's different or exciting about the research and the work that you did?
The simplest answer to that is just that for good or ill, film is just a way to take a really complicated and depressing and difficult story like this part of our history and take it to whole new audiences and much other larger groups of people. But there's also something about the way that the great frustration over the course of writing the book, and if you haven't read it, I know that's only one or two of you, but it's a grim trip, I mean, it really is. It's almost 500 pages of just nightmarish horror. And the things that happened I mean, if anything, the film, in some respects, because in film, it couldn't be quite as graphic as I could be in the written word. I mean, the things that were done were just unbelievable. But the frustration of the writing process and the research process was that these were things that happened almost overwhelmingly to people who, by conventional measures, would be viewed as inconsequential. These were all people, names that nobody had ever heard of, and that there'd never been anything written about Green Cottenham or any of his peers. And in the general telling of American history, those were people who didn't matter, and their names were all but lost from history. Green Cottenham was someone who there were only 5 pieces of paper that I could ever find that documented in any fashion that he had ever existed. He was almost completely erased from history. And so one of the wonderful things about film is that, while being very careful about accuracy and historical precision, that you can animate the lives of people who had been almost completely extinguished. And the reason that white people in America were able to get away with this and live with themselves was by dehumanizing this enormous population of their fellow citizens. And so the power of the film was we could so vividly bring those important, consequential people back to life.
I see. Sheila, can you talk about translating from the book to the film? What was that process like? What sort of research did you have to do? What sort of, training did you call upon to do that?
Sure. Well, first, it was an amazing honor. If you have not read the book, those 4 that didn't, really read it. I mean, he's talking about the content, but it's got a very, very elegant narrative structure built much more fully around Green Cottenham and the generations before him, the white Cottenhams, the black Cottenhams, and it's the kind of detail and complexity and footnoting that you just can't do on screen. So it's not one or the other thing. This doesn't replace the book. It's really very much worth going back and looking at, both in terms of writing and in terms of the content. The translation, obviously, of 400 pages into an 84 or so minute movie is challenging, deciding, within the budget what to bring to life, what Sam, could visualize, but finding a structure also that would work within that confine and working closely with Catherine Allen and with Doug and with Sam to do that. And going back to primary sources, Michelle Phillip did a lot of research, finding going back and finding the records of Ezekiel Archie. And Mary Ellen Curtin had transcribed much more of his letters, and there were just these elegant, cries for help.
Sam, what's one thing that really struck me about this film is that, we're used to seeing films on history that kind of, take people's words and maybe put them on the screen, or maybe they're just narrated. But you used actors for this. Can you talk about what that process was like, as opposed to just having scholars, to actually having actors kind of portray the flesh and blood of this people? What was your thought behind doing that, and how did you approach it?
Delicately. Because anytime you're doing a documentary nowadays and you try to think about how to have historical reenactments, you're really, walking on very delicate ground because you want to try to make sure they don't come across as not too well done. You want to make sure that you try to be artful with them. You want to try to make sure you cast it properly, that the production values are good. So that was really a big concern on my part, on Catherine's part, on all of our parts, to make sure we did it in a way that felt real and felt true to the telling of the story. So when we found the locations, we went down to Alabama. Doug and I had went down to Alabama before we even shot, did a lot of research and travel, checking out locations and stuff. And then when we cast the actors, we wanted to find actors that we felt could represent Green Cottonham, John Davis, Ezekiel Archie. It was just a very delicate process. It's always interesting when you watch these finished projects. Just watching it today, it looks like it just happened. It's like so smoothly. But it really takes a lot of work, a lot of thinking on everybody's part. Sheila, Doug, myself, Catherine, the other members of the crew to really make these things work. So
Jason. Jason.
My son, Jason, the editor. Very, very delicate process. So, I've done reenactments before, and sometimes I wasn't so proud of them. But when I watch these today, I'm very, very proud of what we accomplished.
One, just on the reenactments, just a moment that I tell people about often, those various scenes that you saw that were reenactments, of course, of convicts chained together in the swamp. And there were several versions of that scene. And we shot all that over the course of 2 days. Sam did not know what he was getting into in being involved with me on a project like this. And of course, Sam has done a lot of work with Spike Lee in the past. And at one point, he's out in the swamp with the actors, and I walk up behind him, and amazingly, the craft services table with the snacks on it is following us around in the swamp. It's one of this. I was learning about how filmmaking works. That was a fascinating moment. But I get out there and I start saying to Sam, the director of the film, and playing this role that the author is not supposed to play, of going out and saying, I'm not sure that these guys understand why they're out here in the swamp and all that. And at some point, Sam turns to me and he says, okay, you go talk to them, but if Spike ever heard what I'm letting you do, he would kill me, or something like that. But then we end up having those actors were theater students at a public university in South Alabama, young African-American men. And we got in this conversation with them out in, standing in the water, in the swamp, and said, hey, this is the story that you're telling. This is what's happening. And, you're coming from this place and you're going to that place. And it was for me, a striking moment because in a weird sort of way, these individuals like Green Cottonham, who these ghosts that I had been pursuing, for years and years and years, all of a sudden they got it and they kind of clicked, and they were alive. So there for a few hours, I was in the presence of Green Cottonham.
Another unique thing about this film, not just with the actors, but also with some of the people who are connected by blood to a lot of the folks in this story. And one thing I thought was very unique is that it wasn't just the folks who had a connection to the African Americans in the story, but also some of the people who perpetuated this system, their descendants. Can you guys talk about what went into making the decision to include that? Did you get any pushback from that? Have you had any pushback from that since the film has kind of, done what it's done?
Well, as Doug said in the introduction, it was really his idea. I mean, we were
Take credit for everything good.
Yeah, we were kind of resistant to it. The idea of having contemporary people in this historical documentary seemed to be, what? This doesn't quite make sense. But Doug thought it would really bring another kind of texture to the film, and he's absolutely correct. I mean, when you see Susan Bernard talking about her great-grandfather, it's very powerful. Very powerful. I mean, Sharon Malone's very powerful. So when Doug first brought it up, there was a whole discussion between Sheila and myself and Catherine. Was this going to work? Was this make sense? Was it going to take away from the historical resonance of the piece? But in lots of ways, it just added to it. It really gave it much more texture, much more density, and much more complexity. So it was a great choice.
Yeah, I think it was when we figured out we could use them sort of as a chorus, but they had been coming to Doug ever since Doug's book came out. People had been contacting him with these amazing stories or pieces of family history that hadn't made sense before. And yeah, I think it's it is the strongest part. Right.
Yeah, I think it's maybe the most distinguishing element for a historical film in this sort of sense and the willingness to give that a try. But then once we started doing it, they just did it, because these were individuals who were so traumatized by these revelations of their own discovery. And Christina Comer, the other white woman in the film who's descended from this very, very famous Alabama family that included not just a governor, but several other state officials. And Christina was someone who, she was so traumatized by the revelation of all of this that, she really kind of went through kind of PTSD. I'm honestly a little surprised that she's not in the room, because for years, Christina would appear at almost every event, in this side of the Rockies, she would appear, because it became this kind of passion for her. Her way of trying to kind of write this somehow was to be that voice and to say that it mattered.
And she was of all the contemporary folks in the film, she was the most concerned about the reaction of her family. I think she was the most concerned. She articulated that to Doug and myself. And I think I saw her about 3 years ago, and she lives in North Carolina now. Yeah, I saw her in Durham, North Carolina. But she's a wonderful, wonderful person.
Well, and also, not to drag this out, but after the film came out, but Christina, this young woman, that once she went to divinity school, that's what took her to North Carolina. I think that was also partly motivated by all this. But she told me at one of these events that she appeared at that her father, as she had been concerned about happening, her father afterwards saw the film and then essentially disavowed her. Said, I can't believe you've done this to the family. I don't want to have anything to do with you again, and essentially rejected her because of it. But then a couple years later, she popped up again, and I said, so how are things with your family? And she said, amazingly, a year later, my father called me and asked me to come over, and I went and talked to him, and he said that he finally got it. He finally understood, And so, these are deep and powerful things, and those living folks, the descendants, they're all of our personal connections to the story. It's so easy to see all of this as ancient dead history that's unrelated to the world we live in now. But they're the bridge, they're the bridge into the present. And right now, more than was the case 5 years ago or 10 years ago when the book came out, the relevance of all this to the events that we're living through right now, is, I think, more obvious than it has ever been. And so that's what the Descendants gave us.
Now, I want to make sure I extend an invitation to everyone here, when you have time, to check out one of our newest exhibits, which is called American Enterprise. It's all about business and innovation in the history of the U.S. But there's a section in there that specifically talks about the business of slavery, which is very, very well done and very, very interesting. And I'm using that as a transition to ask you guys my next question, because much of this film sort of talks about the business behind this, what is essentially a form of human trafficking after slavery is supposed to have ended. Can you talk to us and kind of impress upon us how, when we talk about this being a business, how much are we talking about? How entrenched in this are these folks? Because this isn't only just kind of racism for the sake of racism. There's a lot of money that's on the table with this.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in fact, the original story in the Wall Street Journal that led to the book and that led to the film was that story that appeared in 2001, just a few months before 9/11, was one in a series of stories that I wrote in the Journal. And it surprises people sometimes to hear that the Wall Street Journal was publishing these kinds of stories, and today it probably would not be publishing them. But the Journal actually was very interested in these kinds of contrarian examinations of corporate behavior. And what that series of stories was really about was the idea that the role of commerce in the racial depredations of our history has never really been sufficiently confronted. The Civil Rights Movement was about attacking the state and making the state, the government, stop requiring the destruction of African Americans and stop denying them civil rights. But it was overwhelmingly, it was about government. And then there began to be lawsuits and litigation about ongoing discrimination by corporations, but we never really had a national discussion about that the main enforcers of segregation and the main doers of evil against black people were businesses. It was banks that refused to give the loans. It was real estate agents that refused to sell the property, over and over and over again. It's through commerce that segregation was overwhelmingly enforced. And so that's absolutely one of the most important things to draw from all this, but it is also extraordinarily important, and the exhibit that you're talking about is part of this in the book by Ed Baptist, a year and a half ago that came out, The Half Has Not Been Told. But these examinations of slavery as a commercial and economic institution are hugely important because up to the Civil War, beginning of the Civil War, the two biggest industries in America were the business of growing cotton and business of buying and selling slaves. Those were the two largest contributors to the economic output of America. And so the destruction of antebellum slavery had these cataclysmic impact. It would be like taking the catalytic converter engine out of the American economy today. I mean, just imagine what would happen. And so understanding that the economic motivations in all of this is very, very important to understanding how all these terrible things happened.
All right, let's, before we open it up to Q&A, let's talk about the relevance here. Because as you mentioned, Doug, at the very beginning, 13th, did come out not too long ago. So a lot has been made about the prison industrial complex today and parallels between that and what's happened in the past. And I'd like for you all, if you would, briefly to kind of talk about those parallels. What are the similarities? What are the differences? And what do we need to look for and do going forward?
This is maybe slightly off what you're saying, but I teach a course that looks at the modern civil rights movement using the series Eyes on the Prize primarily. My first class, I show this, because what I had discovered was that students, and especially in the predominantly white classes, would start the conversation about civil rights as we let them come into our schools and we gave them this right. And so it was important to set the perspective of it shouldn't have been necessary in the first place, to sort of look at we took it, using that we that they were using, and kind of getting that out of the classroom. And it's very effective for that in that way.
Well, sure. The relevance of all this to the present is, in some respects, is obvious, but maybe not as obvious as it sometimes is. The things that were portrayed in this film are not the same things that are happening today exactly. They're versions of it. I mean, it's astonishing how often things will pop up that are, in fact, exactly this or very close to it. But debt slavery, peonage, particularly Hispanic immigrant workers in South Florida and other places, these cases will pop up of involuntary servitude even happening today that deploy similar labor practices and similar kinds of abuse and physical torture to keep people in line. But many of the other details of how oppression then and oppression today may work are somewhat different. Sometimes people will say to me, particularly back when the book first came out, people in those days, 10 years ago, there was beginning to be a lot of talk about private prisons. That's a bad thing. Then that tailed off a little bit, and the conversation shifted more to mass incarceration. That's a terrible thing. And now private prisons are being talked about again a bit, particularly as the federal government and the current administration goes back to them. But private prisons are not the same thing as this. The single biggest difference being that, in my belief, based on the evidence, the vast majority of the people who suffered these terrible crimes and indignities had in fact violated no law whatsoever. And in today's world, so many of the issues are not about whether it was technically illegal to commit that drug offense, but whether the punishment was appropriate and whether it should have been a law at all. But the fraud and deceit and just the enormous level of deception and fraud that went into all of this is somewhat different. But the one thing that is common to all of this is that, and this does apply to the private prison industry as well, and it applies to private probation officers and all of these ways in which in recent years we've begun to privatize dimensions of the justice system. And that is that whenever a society allows private profit to become any element of the equation of justice, I mean, the administration of justice is the most sacred the most sacred duty of a government and a society, deciding who should live or die or be free or imprisoned. I mean, there's nothing more important than the administration of justice. And for personal profit to be an equation in the execution of justice, to allow that to happen, it opens a society. It's a deliberate decision by society to make itself vulnerable to the most terrible kinds of moral failure. And more and more and more, we are opening ourselves up to that just staggering risk of moral catastrophe.
I would say this. I would go from another angle too. To me, America is always about, anytime people of color take 2 steps forward, America figures out how to take 2 steps back. You see Reconstruction happen. You hear about all these black people become involved in the law. We get the right to vote. We've taken that 2 steps forward, and then all of a sudden Reconstruction is gone, and Jim Crow is put into place. You see what happens in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. Everything is happening. The Great Society with Lyndon Johnson. Then Dick Nixon comes in president, law and order, right? Then you see Ronald Reagan, law and order. And here we go again. We got 8 years of Obama as president of the United States. President Trump, law and order. All the time. This is a cycle of American history. It's a cycle. It's a horrible cycle that this country goes through every time, because we never want to deal with the issue of race in America and how it has shaped this country.
You heard it here first, folks.
Just one other thought on the same thing, just to echo that exact thought, but I'll keep my language clean.
Good luck with that.
But also, one thing like what Sam just said and what I'm about to say now, you can hear these words and say, oh, that's kind of radical talk, but it's really not. These are empirical statements, that we're talking about. And the thing I would add to this is that what has been consistent throughout American history, and we're seeing it, I would maybe say is 2 steps forward, 1 3/4 steps back. We are making progress we are beyond 1865, and I'll give us credit for that. But this forward and back process is the cost of that to our society, the cost of it to individual African Americans, but also just the cost of it to all of us, the talent that has been lost. It's no surprise that since 1970, when African Americans, for the first time, you can make any kind of argument that African Americans began to have broad access to the levers of achievement economically and educationally in American life. Well, since 1970, African Americans have performed economically and educationally, even with all the problems and disparities that still exist. But African Americans have outperformed, I argue, any ethnically identifiable group of people in human history. And in the United States, the broader benefit of all that has been just staggering, just enormous. But the consistent theme through American history has been that we are a nation founded on white supremacy. White supremacy is as fundamental to the American creed as is a notion of liberty. In fact, if you go back to what the Founding Fathers and the people of America, white people of America, thought in the 1770s, they viewed the oppression of enslaved Africans as an element of liberty. Part of what made liberty so sweet was the existence of enslavement of this other group of people. And our inability to extinguish the poison, the infection of white supremacy from American life is still a very real thing. And one of the expressions of that is that white Americans, on the whole, these days, oftentimes unconsciously, though not quite as unconsciously as we might have once thought, are more comfortable when a significant number of African American men are under the control of the state or someone who represents the state. And that was slavery in one time, that was Jim Crow and another kind of slavery in another era, and now it's the prison system.
We're going to go ahead and open up for some questions, and we'll start to your right, my left.
The plight of modern migrant laborers, it seems to me to be horrible too, because if they complain, there's always a chance that they're going to get sent back, and they have that constant risk. But we talk about this as something that came out of slavery. Do we know what happened to prisoners, white and black, before the Civil War? Was there this sort of corporate hiring out? Anybody have any idea?
Yeah, there was. I mean, the practice of leasing out convicts was in fact borrowed from slavery, from antebellum slavery. That in fact, in the last decade before the Civil War, there was this kind of revolution going on in the economic system of slavery and the business of buying and selling and trading in enslaved people. And there had always been the theory that that enslaved people were only suited to agricultural work and not suited to more complex industrial tasks, even of the early industrial era before the Civil War. But in the last years before the Civil War, there began to be extensive use of enslaved African Americans in building railroads, for the first time in textile mills, and the first factories that were being built in the South. The Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, which became one of the biggest industrial enterprises in the country, was worked entirely by enslaved black laborers, many of them extraordinarily highly skilled workers. And so there was this whole revolution happening in the nature of slavery in the last years before the Civil War that obviously demonstrated that, of course, African Americans were capable of doing this work and doing it superbly well, and they did. And so then when the Civil War interrupted that, many of the people, like the character John Milner, who we talked about at some length in the film in Alabama, those were the people who, after the Civil War, were saying, "Man, that really worked. That was a highly effective thing, and we need to get some version of that back as fast as we can." And so there was a direct connection between those events and the way that all of this developed, but with the big difference being, the other point made in the film, that slavery had, in a perverse way, old-fashioned slavery, protected the enslaved people because of their value. You did not want to work a slave to death or deliberately injure them in a way that they couldn't work. There was too much money invested in them. But once this new system was created, where Sam Pollard of 1895 could just be snatched off a back road and sold into a coal mine somewhere at a cost of maybe $50 or $60, and if he died a week later, you could just go kidnap somebody else.
So Ernest Green says in the film.
Exactly. Yeah. So suddenly and so that was what made, in some respects, these new practices that much more diabolical.
Let's go over here to the left.
It's often said that history is written by the victors, but maybe we can also say there's a corollary to that, which is the history of sufferers can be rediscovered when the victors keep extensive records. Can you connect, or at least I was just at Mount Vernon again, and this is the first time I was there on my own without a gaggle of kids being a chaperone, so I got to see things in a different way than I've ever done before. And so one of the things that I was very affected by is George Washington's named slaves now have family societies of slave descendants. And there is an extraordinary video on the exit of the museum area where descendants talk about at what young age they finally realized that my great-great was, not only were they a slave, they were a slave where I just was walking. And so they talk about at what age they first make the connection, and then as they deepen in that understanding as they get older. And I thought that was extraordinary, and I saw parallels between that and what you presented. But can you sort of comment on, in a way, this is a kind of history that we can only know because, in their case, because George Washington kept meticulous notes.
Yeah, but the thing that's important now is that, people like Doug Blackman and Pete Daniel in the film and all these writers now understand that all this material, but now they go in and they research it, they dig deep into it, and they pull out things that shows that there was a much more level of complexity than the history I learned as a kid, that George Washington was a great man and he never told a lie, So I think it's invaluable that we have people like Doug Blackman and Pete Daniels and all the others I mentioned, Grossman in the film, who now know that they can go into these records and they can pull out this history and they can give us another perspective. That's what's important now to me about history. That's why history is such a valuable tool, because as people progress, they learn that there's other ways to see this history than the ones that we've been given to for so many years. So, I applaud the fact that historians are constantly coming up with new perspectives and new ways to look at this long history. You're absolutely right, that was well documented.
But also there is a real pattern, and I think you were making a certain kind of reference to Nazi Germany as well, that the Nazis kept extremely good records as well on, and people keep records on things that they're either proud of, and that certainly was the case with the Nazis, that they were very pleased with their evil deeds, and they had motivations to keep good records for it, but also people keep. They preserve records of things that, at a minimum, they don't consider to have been bad things, and that's the case here. Is that Oh, sure, of course, and because it was a business, and so exactly, and so these are things that there long was an assumption. I mean, one of the most distinguishing things about the book was that I didn't accept a prevailing historical convention that the records of all of this had been lost. There was this assumption that because the people were so inconsequential and so many of them had been convicted of misdemeanor crimes, that that would be like trying to find parking tickets in Washington, D.C. from 1922. They wouldn't exist. Now, I bet you actually they do exist. If you make the assumption that historical records do exist, that's how you find them. And so it turned out that there was this tremendous record that had been largely ignored by historians.
We're a little over time, so I'm going to ask the last two questions. Can you please keep them brief? And we'll start over here to the left.
Okay. Thank you. I'm an educator, and I'm very, very concerned about the elementary school pipeline to prison that's going on now. For those of you who do not know what that is, that right now they are studying third grade reading scores to determine how many prisons they're going to build in the future instead of how many community centers they're going to build. As an educator and a parent, I know I'm not the only one who cares about this. Will anyone please comment about this?
Well, I think the main thing I would say to that is that, we all are hearing a lot about the school-to-prison pipeline, not that specific detail, though I've heard a version of that before, too, and I think what you're referring back to is back on the notion of private enterprise being a part of the administration of justice. And so what you have are private prison companies trying to forecast what the business opportunity is going to be for building more prisons, and so they had then identified this. What's the third grade literacy rate, and believe, at least, I hope it's not true, but they believe that that's some barometer of what the volume would be for future private prisons. And yes, that is shocking and cynical, but it also speaks to just how cynical it is that that it's the government and those citizens who are engaged in the pursuit of the common good who should be making calculations that relate to how many civic centers to build, how many community centers, and those kinds of and that, to me, I'm not surprised that private enterprise has come up with a clever, if evil, way of predicting this terrible future. What bothers me more is that in our loss of confidence in government, and basically our loss of faith in the nature of pursuing common good, that there's not the other calculation going on, and that we're not rallying behind it in armies of people.
I just want to add to that too, which I'm sure you know, the other issue is calling public education a failure and privatizing public education and marginalizing it. And making these silos of different groups and stuff. That's also part of it, to have this, it's a whole different panel, but yeah.
We're with you.
Panelists and also folks who ask questions, we want to thank you all so much again for sharing your film with us.
Pleasure.
I just want to let you all know, Slavery by Another Name is still streaming online. There's also a 20-minute version for classroom use. And also, I just learned today that Created Equal, which is a packaging of Slavery by Another Name with 3 other civil rights films, has been extended as part of Created Equal, which is a community engagement initiative that's been rolled out across the country. So go to NEH.gov for more information on that. It's going to go through 2018.
Thank you all so much for being with us today. I hope that at least some of you are going to be able to stick around for our keynote, which is happening around 7, and that will include 2 members of our panel here, as well as Jeff Bieber. So I hope that you all will be around for that.
And
Thank you.
I'm sorry, but
Yeah, go
just a
ahead.
little promo. At the later event, we're going to show some clips from the film that Sam and I are working on now called The Harvest, that will be coming out next year, we hope. So come back for that, and we'll be talking about another film as well that relates to this one.
I'm sorry, that will actually be around 6 o'clock, not 7. Those of you who have programs are going, what is he talking about, 7 o'clock? Again, thank you all so much for coming to our second annual History Film Forum.